you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to turn to the book of 1 Samuel. We'll be in chapters 1 and 2. But before we get to that, I want to draw your attention to a very serious scientific study that was done about mothers, where elementary children were asked some of the following questions. Why did God make mothers? Two best answers. She's the only one who knows where the Scotch tape is. And mostly to clean my house. How did God make mothers? I like this one. Magic plus superpowers plus a lot of string. God made my mom just like she made me. He just used bigger parts. What ingredients are mothers made of? Well, mothers are made out of clouds and angel hair and everything nice in the world and just one dab of mean. They had to get their start from men's bones. What kind of little girl was your mom? I don't know because I wasn't there, but my guess is she would be pretty bossy. They say she used to be nice. Why did your mom marry your dad? My dad makes the best spaghetti in the world, and my mom eats a lot. She got too old to do anything else with him. My grandma says she didn't have her thinking cap on. Who's the boss at your house? My mom doesn't want to be the boss, but she has to be the boss because Dad's such a goofball. Mom, you can tell by her inspection. She sees stuff under the bed. What does your mom do in her spare time? Mothers don't have spare time. To hear her tell it, she pays bills all day long. If you could change one thing about your mom, what would it be? She has this weird thing about cleaning my room. I'd get rid of that. What's the difference between moms and dads? Moms know how to talk to teachers without scaring them. Dads are taller and stronger, but moms have all the real power because that's who you need to ask if you want to sleep over at your friends. What would it take to make your mom perfect? On the outside, she's already perfect. Or on the inside, she's already perfect. Outside, I think some kind of plastic surgery. Diet. You know, her hair, I dye it maybe blue. You know, we can have fun with mothers because we love them so much, and the truth is that they influence our lives perhaps more than anyone. In fact, surely more than anyone if you were fortunate enough to grow up with your mom. The famous preacher G. Campbell Morgan had 4 sons who also were all preachers. And during a family reunion, someone asked one of the sons, trying to stir up trouble, who's the greatest preacher in the family? And the son looks right at his father and he says, Mother. And they all look around at each other and nod and go, yeah, Mother. The famous evangelist George Whitefield once had a woman approach him and tell him that God had called her to preach. And of course, that wasn't necessarily his tradition, but he quickly got out of that, and he said, well, let me ask you this. He said, has God given you any children? And she says, yes, well, I have several children. And he said, splendid. God has already given you a congregation. And, you know, there's some truth to these stories because our mothers influence us as much as anyone. They lay a foundation of love and spirituality, hopefully, that will last us for our entire lives. And in most cases, mothers are tools and instruments in the hands of God. And so that's why today I want to talk about the ministry of motherhood. And actually, it works for fatherhood too, but because it's Mother's Day, we'll just go ahead and give them the nod there. But I'm not sure that anyone understood the ministry of motherhood more than Hannah from the Bible. And so I'd like to go ahead and read from 1 Samuel starting in chapter 1. I find it interesting that one of the most significant books in the Old Testament begins with the story of Hannah. And it reads like this. There was a certain man named Elkanah who had 2 wives. That's his trouble right there. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of his meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you so downcast? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of her life. So we see that Hannah desperately wanted to have a family. And you say, oh, well, that's only because that mean old snaky Peninnah just kept, pestering her and rubbing it in. Well, no, that's why the goading worked. If she didn't care, then what Peninnah did wouldn't have bothered her. But it did bother her. That's why every time Peninnah did it, it said she would get so upset that she couldn't eat. And she would just weep all day long. And when they went to the temple there and to the Lord's house, she would sit there and she would weep and she would pray all day long. And that's why she's making this deal with the Lord, so that she could have children. Because Hannah wanted children more than anything. In fact, she seemed obsessed with this. And almost like she knew somehow that this was a purpose for her life and something that God wanted for her, but she just couldn't understand why she couldn't have children. And then we read on. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went away and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. Now, Hannah ultimately had other children, but her firstborn was Samuel. And Samuel ultimately became a very great man. In fact, he was one of the greatest prophets in the history of Israel. It was, after all, Samuel who singled out David and anointed David to be king over Israel, and it was Samuel who guided Israel through some of the most turbulent and difficult times in all of Israel's history. And I believe that Samuel was such a great man in part because Hannah was such a great mother. And I believe that Hannah was such a great mother because she understood the ministry of motherhood. And Hannah loved her children. But I think there's a difference between loving your children and seeing your children as a ministry. Because I think all parents love their children, don't they? I mean, I think they do, or all good parents do, certainly. In fact, I don't know of a single mother in this room who, if it came down to it, would not exchange their life for their child, or a single parent in this room for that matter. If you had to make that choice, just about all of us would do that. But then at the same time, I've seen parents who almost act at times if their children, are not burdens, but they would exchange their life for them, but then in the course of life, they almost act as if this child is a burden or a distraction or maybe a way to gain attention. And Hannah couldn't do that. She couldn't be that way because to her, in her mind, her children were her ministry. And they didn't use that language back then, and they didn't talk about it that way back then, but we see the way that Hannah is. And how desperately she desires these children, and how desperately she desires to pour herself into these children. And for her, this is her purpose in life. This is what she's about. This is, in her mind, her primary ministry. And what I want to do here is I want to chastise the church a little bit. Because for years at church, and I read about it all the time, and I know what people say, and I understand the culture that we have in our churches and kind of how it works. But for whatever reason, somehow, we have gotten to the point in contemporary evangelical culture where ministry is something that you do at church or you do through the official church institution or organization. That ministry is teaching Sunday school. Ministry is helping maybe, at the food pantry or serving up here on the stage. But it's something that happens through the organization, through the institution, really to build up the institution. And frankly, that's a little bit self-serving and disingenuous of us. Because the fact of the matter is that ministry is really what we do when we leave church. And we go into our homes and in our communities and to our jobs, and we ought to see what goes on out there as our ministry, and church is the place where we are equipped for this ministry. And what happens is we get confused, and sometimes I've actually seen this, I've experienced this and had to help people work through this, is we get so tied up in that mindset that we will neglect our families to go do ministry at church. And I want to tell you right now that if you are a parent, if you're a mother or a father, your primary ministry is your children. You may have other ministries. You may have ministries here at church, but there is no more important ministry for you than the ministry that God has given you in your children. And He has blessed you with those children, and you are responsible for those children and ministering to them and trying to raise them in the instruction and admonition of the Lord. And our lives are busy. We got stuff going on all over the place. And I think for a lot of us, we need to maybe prioritize and bring our families into focus and bring our lives into focus about what is truly important. And Hannah understood this. And she was able to focus on what is the ministry of motherhood and pouring into her children. So now that we've established that, and that, our role as parents, our role as mothers and fathers is a ministry. And again, that's primarily what I wanted to communicate today, is that we have to see it that way. But now that we've done that, let's talk a little bit about what that means, and maybe we can see some examples of Hannah and how she models the ministry of motherhood in her own life. The first thing that we see with Hannah is that she prayed for her children. And, I mean, she just didn't pray for her children. I mean, she prayed for her children. She was like a prayer warrior. In fact, the first 2 chapters of 1 Samuel read pretty much like Hannah's prayer journal, like her own private prayer diary. She is praying for children, and then she's praying for her children, and that God would bless them, and that they would walk with the Lord, and that they would be great in stature before the Lord. We read in verse 25, they brought the boy Eli, and she said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. So, that, like in a prayer journal, some people have prayer answers. They have the prayer request, and then they have the answer prayer. She doesn't have an actual journal. Her journal's in her heart, but she's telling Eli about that. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he would be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. And then after this, the first 10 verses of chapter 2 is Hannah praying again, praying some more. I can't read it all because we don't have time, but she's just praying through this whole thing. And she's thanking God that she has received this child and that she's been able to give this child to the Lord. And so I think that this idea of praying for your children is so crucial in the ministry of motherhood, the ministry of fatherhood, the ministry of what it is to be a parent. We need to be praying for our children. And I know that some of us here, we kind of struggle with that. Not because we don't want to, but we think to ourselves, I just don't know how. I don't really know what to say or how to go about doing this and really what that's supposed to look like. And honestly, it's really not that hard. I'll just maybe share with you some insights to my own prayer life and praying for my children. And I'm going to tell you this. I'll confide with you in this. That the older my children get, the more I pray for them. The older my children get, the more they need me to pray for them. And it's true, but you just feel compelled more and more. And I think really, in a lot of ways too, it's because I have absolutely no control over so many of the things that are happening in their lives. I have children that don't live in this state. I have children that don't live in this country. They are at the mercy of factors and things that are going on, again, that I have absolutely no control over, and I have to be in a position where I give them to the Lord. And really, at that point, the only thing I can do to some extent is to pray. And so I do. I pray for them. I pray, first of all, typically when I pray for my children, I pray for God to protect them. I pray for God to protect them physically, emotionally, socially, but more than anything else, I pray for God to protect them spiritually. Because we live in a day and age of unprecedented attacks on Christianity and Christians. And there are so many things out there right now in the world that are intentionally going after Christians and trying to undermine our faith and compromise our very souls if that were possible. And so, whatever they can do, and there's all of these ideas and all of this stuff out there right now that are pulling at our children. And those of you with adult children, again, you know what I'm talking about. But those of you with children still in the home, even in the schools and stuff that's going on now, there's so much out there trying to pull our children away from the Lord. And we need to be praying that they stand strong and pray a hedge around them of protection and just pray that these things not have the influence that they intend in the lives of our children. Secondly, I pray that my children would walk with God. That they would be men and women of God. That they would be men and women whose hearts are inclined towards God and tuned in to God. I pray frequently for their future spouses, because they're out there experiencing all of these same things, and I want their future spouses to be people of God and people who walk with God, and so I pray for them. Obviously, I pray for specific things that I know are going on in their lives. You know, the phone call that I get, once a week, once every other week, and we talk and we, hey, what's going on and what's on your heart? We pray for those things. And then finally, without fail, and this is the part that I know that I really have to pray for the most, and that is I pray for me to be able to speak into their lives in appropriate ways and in effective ways. I pray that I am a good example of what it means to be a believer. I pray that I'm a good example as a father and as a husband. And I pray that they will listen to whatever wisdom that I have to share, that they are open, that we maintain that relationship where I can even speak into their lives. And I do this, and I spend time praying for my children because I think, if I don't care enough, or if I don't invest enough to at least be praying for my children, then how can I expect God to want to work in their lives? How can I expect God to care about them if I don't care enough to even be praying for them? And I think Hannah, certainly felt that way. I mean, obviously, she was a woman of deep prayer. She was a woman who was accustomed to just laying her heart bare before God. And I so admire her prayer life. It was so transparent, and she was so bold in it. And she just was just so forward with God in claiming the things that she desired for her life and her family and for her children. And the really cool thing about that is that God honored her request. And the way the text reads, and it's not like lockdown logic, if A, then B, that sort of thing. But it implies that it was because Hannah was praying, that it was because she was pouring out her soul and pouring out her heart to the Lord, that God answered this request. And Eli had a part in that and all those sorts of things. I think another way that Hannah approached the ministry of motherhood is that she did everything that she could to lead her children to love God, to love the Lord. And she did this by, I think, first of all, setting an example. She set an example of faith, of faithfulness, of love, of prayer, like we just talked about, and even of giving her children, over to the Lord. And, this last part, let me back up. So she was an example of prayer and sacrifice and all those things. She was also very open and transparent about her own spirituality. I think as I read the story and the account of Hannah, I think that's the thing that I appreciate the most about her, is just how raw honest she was. She wore her emotions on her sleeve. She wore her heart on her sleeve. And I guarantee you that her children knew what was going on in her life, and she knew how she felt about them. And she was very transparent with her children about her faith, and with everybody, really, about her faith. I think she shocked Eli the priest when she was praying, and he accused her of being drunk. He just wasn't used to that level of honesty. He wasn't used to that level of transparency. But I think in being so open about where she is with the Lord, and she wasn't embarrassed to be praying in that way, and she wasn't embarrassed to be demonstrating a very open spirituality, I think that had to carry over later on to her children. I think she brought them regularly to the temple. She brought them to the Lord's house at Shiloh. Obviously, they didn't have church back then the way we think of it, but in essence, she brought her children to church. And then finally, she dedicated her children to the Lord. And I think this is the part that in a lot of ways, kind of throws some of us off because we're like, man, I don't know how she could do that. You know, she had this child and then she took him to the temple to be raised by the priests. And we're like, I couldn't give up my children that way. I couldn't do that. I don't understand that. But you see, Hannah understood some things. She understood, first of all, that her children did not ultimately belong to her, but they ultimately belonged to the Lord. And she understood that the Lord had a plan for Samuel. And that the Lord's plan for Samuel was in Samuel's best interest. And that if she was going to look after Samuel's best interest, then she needed to give him over to the Lord. And I don't think maybe it's even exactly the way we envision this in our heads. Because it wasn't like she ceased to have a relationship with Samuel. She still saw Samuel. She still had a relationship with him. He just slept at the temple. He was doing his duties, but she still was in his life and had a part of her life and was a part of her life. And so this dedication idea, I think, is really powerful. And is that not exactly what we do when we have parents come up here and dedicate their children to the Lord? They're acknowledging that, hey, these children do not ultimately belong to us as parents, that they belong to God, and that we are stewards of these children. They are acknowledging that God has a plan for their child, and that God's plan is in the child's best interest, and that if they are going to fulfill that plan and do what's best for their children, then they need to do everything within their power to raise that child in the ways of the Lord and according to the way the Lord desires and not the way that they desire. And you say, well, what exactly does that look like? What does that mean? Because I wonder if sometimes there isn't a disconnect. You know, we have the parents come up, and in their minds, maybe it's almost kind of like the Baptist way of doing a infant baptism. You know, we're just kind of saying, you know, the Lord's going to watch over this child, and we're asking the Lord to bless the child. But what they don't always understand is that they have a role in that, and that God wants to use them in that role. And you say, well, what exactly is that? What does that look like? What is expected in the ministry of motherhood or in the ministry of fatherhood? And I think Hannah lays it out really nice. You know, to set that example. To set that example in faith and faithfulness and love and service and prayer and sacrifice. To allow your children to see you honoring the Lord with your life. To allow them to see you living in fear and respect and love of the Lord goes a long way to set that example. I think second, to live transparently. That you're the same people at home as you are at church. That you're honest. That you're open about your faith. I think third, bring them to church. Hannah was in church, or she was at the temple. She was at the Lord's house praying and doing the things that she should do and that she was supposed to do. You know, I think this is huge. If on a Sunday morning, you know, you get up and your children are like, hey, are we going to church? No, I don't feel like it today. You know, I think I'm going to sleep in. Or we're going to go do this over here that really could wait until after church. But when your children see that church and being in God's house is not exactly a priority, what does that communicate to your children? And then how are they going to view church and act towards church later on in their lives? And then finally, you give them over. You dedicate them to the Lord, which means all of the other things that are involved in raising the child God's way rather than your way. You know, it starts with the prayer that I talked about earlier. It starts with, you know, bringing them to church and making that a commitment, making that a priority. teaching them about the Lord in the home. But it's so many little things. You know, I talked earlier about how every parent in here would exchange their life for their child. But most of the time, we're not asked for one big, giant, sacrificial decision to give ourselves away in one big instance. But we are asked to give ourselves away. And we are asked to sacrifice our lives for our children with 100 little decisions every single day. Your child walks in, something's going on in their life, you turn the TV off, look them in the eye, engage them, and have the conversation that needs to be had. Again, you're tired, you want to sleep in, you get them up, you go to church anyway, you bring them. You're tired, you don't feel like praying, maybe you pray in the morning, you get up, you pray anyway. You watch over your children, you ensure that they're having the best influences. A new friend comes over to play, you're sticking your head in that room every 10 to 15 minutes to make sure that that's going in a positive, healthy way. You're not hovering, you're not the helicopter parent, but you're there monitoring, you're making sure. It's all those little things, those little decisions. It's saying I love you to your children at least once a day, and you're saying I love you to them at least a dozen times a day through your actions. That's the ministry of motherhood. And that's what I believe that Hannah understood so well, and that she exemplified for us so well. She saw her family, her children, as her primary ministry in life, and she was going to give it everything she had. Through prayer, teaching her children to love the Lord, and in all those little things that communicated that they were dedicated to the Lord and that she was going to raise them in the way that God wanted her to. I tell you what, if you have had a mother like that, you are so, so, so blessed. And God can use a mother like that and a parent like that. If you're a mother, a father, even if your children are grown, there are elements of this that we can use in their lives, that we can be in their lives. And if we can't do anything else, we can certainly pray. And so let's be encouraged. Let's be inspired by Hannah and her example this morning. And may we all embrace the idea that the children that God has given to us are our ministry. They are our most important ministry. And may God bless us as we serve Him in this way.